Thank you for joining us today. My name is Jen Massey. I'm the Pro Bono Director at Children's Law Center. We are here for part 3, the final part of our custody, guardian ad litem pro bono training. We are so glad that you joined us, and I'm going to give just a brief overview before we jump in to today's content. So thanks again for being here. So if you're new to Children's Law Center, then we can share just very briefly with you some of the work that we're doing. We focus our work on family health and education, fighting so every child in DC can grow up with a loving family, good health, and a quality education. Those areas are the areas where we place pro bono cases and where we need pro bono volunteers to assist us. So we are talking today about our custody guardian ad litem work, and of course that falls into the family law work that we're doing. We are supporting our pro bono lawyers, screening these cases, providing trainings and resources like today, and then we have mentors. So these are lawyers who are handling these cases and having lots of years of experience in this work and being able to guide you as you're doing the work. We are here as a part of our virtual training series. So you might be joining us live today for this session, or you might be watching this on demand. We are holding trainings and offering them on demand right after we've done them, so that people can reach out with any questions. If you're watching them on demand, you can see the series for each practice area. You'll see here as well a cultural humility training that is intended to support all of the work that we do as we're looking to provide culturally humble representation for our clients, no matter the practice area. So today's training, that part 3, where are we now? We've gone over our role of the GAL training in part 1. We talked about custody law and procedure in part 2. And today I'm so excited that we have the director of our social work project to talk to you about a couple of different sections. We're putting them together because this is through the lens of a social worker's expertise. So communicating with children and teens, what are some of the key considerations? And then also an overview of various issues that come up in these cases, from domestic violence, substance abuse, and child abuse and neglect. So we're gonna talk through those matters today. I have a note on here about remote representation. We'll talk a little bit about remote representation, how that comes into play with communicating with children and teens, particularly during the pandemic. It's also something we can mentor around and talk through just thoughtfully for each case. And if you have questions while you're joining us live, you can pop them in the chat. We will turn the recording off at the end if you want to engage after. And we will, engage after the training if you're watching it on demand. Feel free to send me an email. Very much happy to engage with you. Any questions you have about cases, any questions you have about the work. Other resources to support you, we've got them all on our website. So you can see, if you go to childrenslawcenter.org and that pro bono button at the bottom of the page, you're going to see on the right-hand side, you can click on links to different materials. So there are training manuals, there are presentations, videos, etc. We have cases available, and this is a high need area. The court is looking for guardian ad litem attorneys to represent these children who are caught in high conflict custody disputes. So if you are interested in doing one of these cases, interested in a case that you've seen we've had available, shoot me an email. I'm happy to talk with you. It's always an individual matching process to see what might be a good fit for you, and ultimately in serving the client in the case. Without further ado, before we turn it right over, I'm going to mention that in the chat here, or you'll see it on the screen, we do want your feedback. What is working? What can we improve upon for our virtual trainings and for the trainings generally in these content areas? So please don't hold back feedback. I'm a big fan of it and would love to hear how we can support you better and what we're doing that is effective. So thanks again for joining. I'm going to go ahead and close out of my screen so that our presenter today can open hers. So you're going to hear from Kim Dalton, who is the director of our social work project at Children's Law Center. Kim, thank you so much for joining us, and I'm going to hand it over to you to get started with your first section.
Great. Hi, thank you. Thank you, Jen, for that introduction. And thank you everyone for joining us. I'm excited to be here live from my dining room. So today we are going to be talking about communicating with teens, domestic violence, and substance abuse, as well as child abuse and neglect. And just a couple of things that we want to talk about, because we're living in a different time So when this training was developed, we were doing a lot of in-person investigation and interviews and meetings. And so now that we are in the midst of the pandemic, we're finding we have to be a little bit more creative because in-person is limited. And so throughout this presentation, there'll be a couple of places where I will make a point in red, and that is so that it can be highlighted as something that's specific to this time with COVID-19. So for the communication training today, we have two main goals. One, we want to offer you a couple of tools to support and facilitate your conversations with clients, as well as to help you build rapport with them. And then also, I want to provide you a little bit of information about the developmental context for communicating with children and teens. So when you first are assigned a case, there'll be a couple of things that you want to consider in preparation for meeting your client for the first time. The first thing you want to consider is the age of the child, as well as the developmental range of your client. So you may have a client who's 9 years old chronologically, but emotionally they may be younger than that. Intellectually, they may be older than that, and they may also look a different age than their chronological age. So you want to think about who you'll be communicating with on all of those levels. So it's important to talk a little bit with the caregivers or any other collateral contacts that you might have to give you a little bit more information about the child in preparation. It's also important to talk to those people about what the child might already know about the court case. And this can help you to identify how the child might perceive your visit and any need to ease any concerns or clarify inaccuracies about the process. You can also ask collateral contact, specifically the caregivers, and in some cases, teachers or other people who are involved in the child's life, about how the child is doing in general. To give you a sense of what the baseline is for the child's current functioning and how they're feeling about the situation that they're in at this time. In the beginning of getting to know your client, you really want to focus on building a trusting relationship. Kids are very intuitive. They can perceive things that we think we're hiding well. And so we want to make sure that we're really being thoughtful about how we approach them. And if we are approaching them in a way that makes them feel pressured, it may be more difficult to gather information from them. And then as you're thinking about how you're going to meet with this child, you want to think a little bit about communication. So if we're doing a virtual visit, it'll be important to talk with the caregiver in advance about what kind of options that they have. Is it just going to be a phone call, or could it be possibly something like FaceTime or Zoom? What does the caregiver have access to? And then how can the child potentially meet with you in private? So building rapport and trust will take multiple meetings. If you were meeting with this child in person, I'm always encouraging attorneys to plan to meet with their client multiple times. The first time may just be sort of an intro and get to know each other. And in subsequent meetings, you may be able to gather more information that's going to be specific to the case. I think in this time of the pandemic, we're finding it's even a little more difficult to engage with child clients. Even though I think that kids are pretty tech savvy, it seems that they don't really want to get on video very often, and phone calls tend to be a little bit shorter. So I think it's helpful to prepare yourself that you might actually be doing many more contacts over video conferencing or over the telephone, but maybe for shorter periods of time. It's also really key to be consistent and follow through. A lot of our clients have had their trust broken in the past, or they have perceptions of professionals that maybe haven't followed through. So when you're making a plan to visit with them or have some kind of contact with them, you want to be assured that you can actually follow through. And if you're going to do something, you say you're going to look into something, it's so crucial that you actually are able to do that thing and then come back and report as as the plan was between you. Also, something to consider is that a child's presentation will change depending on the day. I mean, all human beings, we have our moods and different things that impact how we're feeling. So it'll be important to have a couple of different meetings to get a sense of the whole child, not just the child on that specific day. It's totally okay if the information that you gather is from collaterals. And I know during this time in the pandemic, there may be less collateral, so you'll have to be creative. You might want to ask the caregiver who else is still engaging with the child right now. Perhaps they're still interacting with a neighbor, and maybe that neighbor might be willing to talk with you if the caregiver gives permission. Or perhaps they're still doing their online education and you can talk with the teacher. Sometimes the child is just not up for sharing information, or you may not get everything you need. And so it's totally okay to rely on others to provide you some of the things that you're missing. Anytime I'm communicating with the child, I'm thinking about how I can create a safe space, because in order to build trust and to gather information and to have productive communication, the child has to feel safe with you. So I ask myself, if I'm having an in-person visit, how do I build a physical safe space? And if I'm having a virtual or a physical visit, I'm also thinking about how do I promote a safe emotional space. So with regards to physical safe space, if we reach a time in this pandemic where we're doing more and more in person, and that's actually something that's safe and appropriate, all of the meetings should be held in a common space in the home, so not behind a closed door or in a bedroom. For younger children, the caregiver might be a part of some of the meetings that you have until they're comfortable with you, and that's okay. It's often comfortable for the attorney and the child to meet in a common space where they could also maybe see the caregiver, or at least know that they can call for the caregiver and they will hear them if they need something. So you can ask the caregiver where they'll be in the house, and also give the child that knowledge in case they need to reach out to them for some reason. I'm also thinking about, what am I wearing? So my experience of attorneys is they often wear these like power suits, and I think that when we're meeting with kids, it's usually better to go with something that's more business casual. And that's just because it will take, I think it just takes some of the pressure off. We don't know what the child's experience with attorneys have been in the past, or they have their perceptions from television. I also encourage people to be mindful of any perfumes or lotions or aftershaves they might wear. I think trying to go unscented is really key, because smells can trigger children, and we want to create a safe space so they'll share information with us. And so if they're feeling triggered or they're emotionally reminded of something else, it might be difficult to do. So unscented is generally best. And then in person, I'm also thinking about proximity. All human beings have certain comfort levels around how close they are with others. And so I usually ask a child where I should sit, or I'll ask them if it's okay if I sit in a certain spot. And then I'm also mindful of their reaction. So they might say yes, but their face may say something else, like they're a little uncomfortable with it. As far as creating emotional safe space, it's really important to explain your role. And that might take a couple of times in a couple of different meetings, especially given the age of the child. You should follow the lead of the child in the discussion. If something seems a little bit overwhelming or distressing, or they avoid, or they don't want to talk about something, just move on for the time being. It's okay for them to set boundaries, and by honoring the setting of boundaries, you're also helping to build trust. And you can say, it's okay if you don't want to talk right now. Also, note-taking. So I know it's so important that we have accurate information, and certainly the older I get, the more I need to take notes. But sometimes note-taking can cause additional anxiety for kids. They may feel like you're not paying the fullest attention, or they might wonder what's going to happen with that information. So if it's at all possible, I recommend refraining from taking notes, and then wait until you get into your car if you're in a physical meeting situation, or wait until after the video meeting is over and then jot down everything that you can remember. If you absolutely have to take notes, you can ask the child if that's okay to do so, if they're comfortable with that, mindful of their reaction. And then you might read over those notes together afterwards and ask them, did I get this down right? And also it will be helpful to tell them what you might do with those notes. You're going to put them in a folder and lock them away, or you might reference them later so that you can make sure that you express what they want or need. Another thing I'm considering anytime I'm meeting with a child is who's in the room. So certainly you're in the room, and you are bringing your own set of values and perceptions and life experiences to this work. You're also bringing sort of what your feelings are for that day. If you've had a stressful day, you're bringing that along with you. So I often, before I have a meeting with a child, will take a few moments to ground myself, especially if I've had a stressful day, because kids can perceive that. The child is also in the room, and the child's had their own day, and so they might have had a great day and are in a good mood, or they might have had some kind of challenging day, or the parent might have talked to the child in advance of this meeting and have said, don't share this thing, and that might be creating an additional pressure for the child. So these are things to just think about, and again, why it's really important to have multiple meetings, and also to check in with the caregiver about how the child is doing that day and if that's normal for the child. Their caregivers are also in the room, if not physically in the room. They may be emotionally in the room, and the child may have conflicted loyalty to them, and may be thinking about what they should say, or what their caregivers would want them to say. And that may contribute to a sense of confusion for them. I think, while I didn't put this in red for the COVID-19 situation, kids on laptops and on telephones, the caregiver may actually be physically in the room and you might not know it. And so you should just keep that in mind. And if you have, if you're doing a video conference, watch the child. Is the child looking elsewhere while they're talking to you? And see if you can get a sense if anybody else is in the room. And then finally, experiences are in the room. So children have perceptions of court and of lawyers that may be based on television or past experiences or incorrect information. So it's really important to take the time to ask questions and clarify the child's understanding of who you are and what the court is and your involvement. So a few ways to consider communicating with children. This is going to be a little bit harder in the time of the pandemic, but if you're having a physical meeting, play is the child's mode of communication, most often used. You can learn a lot about a child through what they choose to play with and how they play with it. You can invite them to play during your video session, and that would be totally appropriate and would offer you some information, but it's not quite the same if you're not engaging and on the floor with them or at the table with them. You should also invite the child to talk and engage. So you can start with open-ended questions like, tell me about your weekend, or tell me about school. And just allow them to talk and also be comfortable with any silence. I think that, I know for me, when I was starting out in my career, if there was too much silence, I filled it in with my own voice. But if you give a little bit of time, sometimes the child will offer up something else. Also really be present. I think during this time of the pandemic, I find that sometimes be challenging on video conference. I was just joking earlier, my cat might come by and jump on my lap or start meowing. That's distracting. Or somebody else, your children are in the room. So it'll be important to find a space where you can be uninterrupted, at least for, a good 30 minutes. So try to just be as present as possible, not on your phone or interacting with others. You can also show interest through your body language. It'll be important to relax. Again, children are perceptive, but things will show up on your face. You'll be mindful of that, or you want to be mindful of that. But lean in, maintain eye contact without staring, and just saying things like "mm-hmm" and "uh-huh" can go a long way, just to affirm that you're listening to what the child is saying. Also use paraphrasing language. So what I heard you say is that it's really important for you to go to soccer practice with your dad on Saturday. It really gives you the chance to make sure you've heard what the child has said correctly, and they can clarify if it's not what they meant. And it also, gives them that sense that you're really listening. And then finally, have empathy. Try to understand where the child is coming from. So avoid trying to console the child or tell them that everything is okay. And while that might be well intended, it might feel dismissive of what they're worried about. So you can say things like, "It sounds like it made you feel sad when your mom and dad were yelling." Or "It seems like this is really important to you. So I'm here to learn everything I can." And also it's very helpful to normalize. So you can say things like, it can be really hard to talk about your family to new people, or you can say, "Oh, lots of kids struggle with math." With regards to language, you'll want to adapt to the child's language. So if the child is using a specific name for someone, like grandma, maybe you call grandma grandma, but they call grandma nana. So you'll want to use whatever the name is or the word is that the child is using. You should also be mindful of avoiding any legal jargon. We might think that the word is well known or common, but the child may not understand that. And so in our handouts, there's actually an article, The Language of the Child Abuse Interview, and they give an example of a 9-year-old saying their stepmom is overprotective. And when asked what the child meant, it was that the stepmother loves her and takes good care of her. But most adults in the room believed her to be giving negative feedback about her mom. So that just as an example to consider. We also know that from child psychology and child development that children provide the most and the best and most accurate information when they're able to answer freely and without limits to their answers. And so that's why open-ended questions are key. With teenagers, it will be important to directly communicate with them, and they will directly communicate back, and that's the benefit of their being a little bit older. They can discuss their viewpoint, and they're typically more capable of responding clearly and directly about what they want and need. Teens are especially perceptive of authenticity, so they will see right through you if you don't really fully believe in what you're saying, or you're not truly present to the conversation. Also, teens crave to have independence, and they want control in their lives. So finding places where they can have some choice, or you can give them some power, is really helpful in building the relationship and maintaining the relationship. So it could be something like crafting a letter to the judge, or even just choosing what you're going to do together on your video meeting or in-person meeting. And then it was also important to, recognize and verbalize that they're experts on themselves, and that you value their opinion. And sometimes that can be difficult because you are a best interest attorney, but part of, coming up with that best interest analysis is to consider their stated interest. Some attorneys really love, not some attorneys, some children or teens really love having their own attorney, and they're going to appreciate having that relationship with you. But it will be really important to have boundaries. They might ask you for things like gift cards or an Uber ride. It's important to be upfront about what your role is and what you're able to do. I also think it's important to let teens know what hours you're available. Teens tend to be up at all hours of the night, and they might text you and expect that you're going to respond at 11 p.m., but that's not, realistic or what's in the range of professional possibility. So you should let them know that you only respond to text or phone calls at a certain time, and that you'll call them back the next business day. And then, especially with teens, it's important to manage expectations and to follow through. So a few tools for in-person and a couple of ideas for video call types of activities. So if anybody asks me what's the must-have toy or tool for working with kids, it's Uno cards. Almost every kid I know knows how to play Uno, and it's really helpful to have something else to distract them a little bit. It takes the pressure off. Some other things that are helpful are Play-Doh, and then like Slinkies or fidget toys for in-person, and those things are typically quite affordable and can be bought at like a dollar store or Target, but just giving them something to play with their hands while they're talking is helpful. And then I often like puppets, but finger puppets because they're smaller and easy to carry, or dolls because when I'm asking questions about family and they're telling me a story, I might ask them to act it out with their finger puppets or their dolls. And then my next favorite thing to have in my toolbox besides those Uno cards is crayons and paper. It's really affordable and easy to carry around, and you can learn a lot. You can ask them to draw their house or to draw a picture of themselves or of their family, and you may learn a few things from how they draw, and you'll have a chance to ask them some questions about their picture. And then during this time of video visits, it can be helpful in advance when you're talking with their caregiver to find out what kinds of toys they might have available to them at home. Do they have markers and paper? Because you can certainly draw pictures together and share them on the screen. Or you can find out what their favorite toy is, and maybe they'll bring it and show you and tell you about it. Some other things that I think are fun is like a scavenger hunt where you can say, find something in the room that's purple, and they'll go get it, or find something in the room that is comforting to you, and maybe they'll bring over a pillow or a stuffed animal. And this gives you a way to engage, but also learn a little bit about them, and then possibly ask some more questions, some follow-up questions. Later on, in like a couple of meetings later, I might play a feelings guessing game. And if you're up for this, but the child thinks about a feeling that they want to act out for you to guess. I think this can be helpful to learn a little bit about, how the child perceives happiness, or how the child perceives being afraid or angry. They may act out somebody they've seen be angry or sad before, and it gives you an opportunity to ask questions about those emotions. But if I'm asking the child to play, I tend to play too. And then a couple of kid-friendly questions that yield a lot of helpful information. If you woke up tomorrow and had 3 wishes, what would they be? Depending on those answers, you might learn who the child prioritizes in their life, what their values are, what their fears are. There's a lot of information you can gather from that. And then if you fall down at school and hurt your knee, who do you want the school nurse to call? That helps me to learn, like, who in the child's life do they trust? Who do they seek comfort from? Who helps to keep them safe? You can also propose like a hypothetical situation, like let's plan your next birthday party. This is going to be, it's going to be really important to be upfront, like you're not really planning their next birthday party. This is just a pretend experience for them to imagine. But it helps to learn a little bit about, again, like what do they like, what do they value, but the most important question at the end is who will be there. And it gives you a sense of all of the important people in their life, and you can ask follow-up questions like, you know, oh, why would it be important for that person to be there? Or what do you like about that person? And then finally, these two other activities can be helpful for you. They are in the handouts. So one of them just helps you to, the Marvelous Me helps you to gather a little more information about them. The spiral exercise is about learning who is close to the child, and then, you know, what other relationships the child has, and the directions are in your handouts. Okay, we're going to switch gears and talk a little bit about domestic violence, substance abuse, and child abuse and neglect. And our goals for this section is to identify some of the key issues related to DV, substance abuse, and child abuse and neglect, to share a little bit more information about how that might impact your best interest analysis and the best interest of your client, and to understand how to respond as the custody GAL when questions of child abuse and neglect arise. We are only going to be talking about like the very basic surface level information on these topics, and so there's a lot more reading in your custody GAL manual. So you might want to take a look at that. Also, some of the information that we're talking about today can be difficult to hear or might be upsetting given past life experiences. I encourage you to prioritize taking care of yourself. So if you have to step away from this training, it's totally okay. Or if you need to prioritize after the training, doing something nice for yourself, please do that. So in the handouts, there is a case study about a child, Nadine, and in this next section of the training, there is going to be a couple of questions that I have for you to think about, but I just want to turn your attention to this information so you have a little backdrop. This is information you might receive from the court, and this child is, if I'm doing the math right, about 9 years old, Nadine, and this is a custody case. And right now, Nadine lives with her mom, and the judge is, we'll have to update to say this is 9 now that we're in 2020. But the child is 8 or 9 years old, and she's afraid to visit her dad or even be in the same room with him. And so the court believes that the mom does not want these visits to take place, and the court has asked mom extensively why the child is so adamant about not wanting to visit with her dad, but doesn't have very much insight into the reasons for the child's reluctance. The dad denies the mom's allegations that he has threatened and harassed her, and the father hasn't seen Nadine because of her refusal to visit him. So the court also wants Nadine to attend the next hearing. So, domestic violence. So something just to take a moment to think about, you could jot this down on a piece of paper. So during one of your first meetings with Nadine, she tells you that she once witnessed her dad shove her mom into a wall. So what kinds of questions might you want to ask, or what kinds of information might you want to learn about? Just take a moment to consider that. So a couple of questions that I might have, or information I might want to gather is, was this a one-time incident, or was this part of a larger pattern of behavior on behalf of the dad? And I'd also be curious if there were indications of a pattern of coercive controlling behavior, like social isolation, control of financial resources, or stalking. I'd also want to learn whether or not Dad has ever been physically abusive towards Nadine. And then also, what's his general approach to discipline? What's his parenting or his discipline style? And then finally, I would also be curious about what's Dad's perspective on this incident or any past incidents of violence with Mom. Does he have any insight? Does he continue to justify his behavior? And then finally, I'd like to know, what is Nadine's current level of fear, or do I have a sense of there being risk for further incidents in the future? So what is domestic violence? Domestic violence is a pattern of abusive behavior in any relationship that's used by one partner to gain or maintain power and control over another intimate partner. It can be physical, sexual, emotional, economic, or psychological actions or threats of actions that influence another person. And so on this slide are some examples. Using violence for taking control over partners, it's frequent, it's brutal, and it's primarily male perpetrated, and it's an ongoing pattern of domination. So that is the abusive, controlling, violent relationships, or what's called intimate terrorism in some books and research. So that's one level of domestic violence. There's also something called violent resistance, and that's typically initiated by the victim, and it's typically the female partner, and it's in response to the abusive, controlling, violent relationship that I just mentioned. In custody disputes, it's really important to understand whether the violence was in response to intimate terrorism or the abusive, controlling, violent relationship. It's also important to determine, whether or not it was related to a pattern of power and control. And then finally, there is situational couple violence, and that's a third type of domestic violence. And this is not really related to any power control. It's considered to be perpetrated by both partners, typically when they're really angry, and it's usually more mild or isolated incidents. Sometimes it can be chronic and severe, but if it's chronic and severe, anger management and custody arrangements that minimize the risk of escalation between the two should be explored. So in practice, allegations are quite common, and we have to think through some of the next steps when accusations of DV are made. We should be looking for any signs of impact on the children. We should also be attempting to find ways to observe, although again, more challenging during this time of pandemic. So it will be crucial to ask a little bit more targeted questions of the parties and of the collaterals. It will also be important to consult with records and look at what kind of history there is. Is there a pattern there? And talk with other family or friends or professionals that know this family. And then finally, you can talk with your mentor about what you're learning about domestic violence in the family, and consider what experts in the field you might be able to further consult with. There are a number of risks to children, and there are a number of concerns. Obviously, there's any risk or concern when there's violence, but in some instances of DV, there's an increased risk that the child will be abused or neglected themselves. Also, in some instances, children try to intervene in an attempt to protect their parents, and they can be harmed accidentally as a result of that. For younger children, DV disrupts the attachment and bonding process, especially when the parent is holding the child and then there is violence. That can be quite traumatic. And because that DV is quite cyclical, this can be chronic exposure to violence, and in some cases neglect, because the parent is tending to the concerns that they have with the relationship with the partner. And there can be lifelong implications for being exposed to DV. We know from research that sometimes children are more likely to enter DV relationships themselves as adolescents or adults, and they can fill the role of both the batterer and the victim. Some of the signs of DV exposure in children include regression. So, having a child being potty trained, for example, and then having difficulty using the bathroom afterwards. Clinginess, violent play, eating, sleeping problems. There may be school absences or academic difficulty. That might be because the parent is unable to get the child to school, or because the child actually is avoiding going to school to stay home and protect the parent. And then, of course, when there's violence occurring, it can be difficult for children to focus. We also see behavioral and mood changes, somatic complaints like headaches and tummy aches. And then in older kids, sometimes we see substance abuse as a means of coping, or just because there's lack of supervision. And the same with other high-risk behaviors like sexual activity or theft. Most of the survivors are women, and they're typically between the ages of 18 to 24. Studies have shown that there's no correlation between their personality type and being a victim. And abusers tend to deny or make light of the abuse. They will blame the victim for it occurring in the first place. Sometimes they express remorse, but it may not be authentic. And the other more difficult thing is that abusers can be really smart and charming and witty and look so pulled together. And that can be difficult when the victim is often depressed and looking like they're having a hard time. Some other stats are that 1 in 3 women have been physically abused by an intimate partner, so DV is quite common. And that intimate partner violence accounts for 15% of violent crime, and that 1 in 15 children are exposed to domestic violence annually. Okay, switching gears to substance abuse. So going back to the case study with Nadine, let's say in Nadine's case, dad tells you that mom has a marijuana problem, and then mom tells you the same thing about dad. Take a moment and think about what kind of information you would want to gather if you learned these facts. Some things that I would want to consider are, have I ever seen any evidence of substance use in either home? Have I ever seen anybody using substances or any paraphernalia? And then, is there any other collateral evidence of the substance use problem? Has anybody else shared information that might lead me to be concerned for that? Is there any evidence that substance use is impacting parenting? So substance use alone may not be a concern, but if substance use is impacting parenting, for example, a parent is drinking too much and then they don't get up in time to ready their child for school, that would be an example of substance use impacting the parenting. Has Nadine ever reported any concerns of substance use by her parents? And then also I'd want to know if there might be any unaddressed mental health concerns that could indicate a concern for substance abuse. We know that mental health issues and substance abuse are highly related. It's also key to know that allegations about substance abuse on both sides are frequently unfounded, but really common. And if those are occurring on your case, you'll want to consult with other professionals regarding assessment and treatment. And certainly, you'll want to talk to your mentor if you have questions or concerns that you can't answer. I'd also like to highlight that there is substance abuse, and that doesn't necessarily mean that there's addiction. So substance abuse is the use of a substance where it negatively impacts one's functioning in varying domains. Addiction is actually more of a complex issue, not issue, but illness, and it's characterized by intense and sometimes uncontrollable drug cravings along with compulsive drug seeking. And the use of that substance typically has devastating consequences. Some indicators of substance abuse. So if you hear from the caregivers or the children or other collaterals, if you see paraphernalia around the home, any observations of mood changes or changes in behavior, financial stress that doesn't have another cause, difficulties with work and relationship, and then criminal behavior. And then also, just for that slide that I just had there, it's also important to know that each type of drug has different physical indications of use. And so you might have to, do a little research depending on what the drug is to see, what the typical behavioral manifestations are. The impact on kids can include issues with prenatal development when the parent is using while pregnant, and then delays as a result of that prenatal exposure or the continued use afterwards. So delays in emotional and physical development. Because the parent is under the influence, it can disrupt the bonding process between them. Children who have kids who are abusing substances have more difficulty in school, and parents who are under the influence don't supervise kids as much as they would if they weren't using substances. We also see that kids tend to take on a parent role when their parent isn't providing for their needs. So we often see older siblings maybe preparing meals for younger siblings or providing the supervision. There is still a social stigma around substance abuse and addiction, and so it can be difficult for kids to talk about it. And then we often, well, not often, I would say sometimes see a correlation between substance abuse and child maltreatment. So we might see more neglect because the child isn't getting their needs met because the parent is under the influence. And in some cases, we may see some physical abuse. So when there's a concern about substance abuse, the first step is to have an assessment done to figure out how serious is the problem. Is it an addiction or is it substance abuse? And then what kinds of treatment would be most appropriate? As we're trying to assess recovery, it'll be important to understand kind of the pattern and the history of the substance use and what led to it. People in recovery often refer to a rock bottom that will occur. I'm often looking to see, does the adult or whoever is struggling with the substance use have the desire to change? Is it an authentic desire to change? People who are recovering from substance use or abuse rather are really thinking through what are their triggers for use, and then working to avoid those triggers or to have a plan for when they occur. And that can include changing people, places, and things, because people who abuse substances may do it with other friends or family members. It'll be necessary for them to not spend as much time with those folks. Or they may think about using substances in certain places or when certain activities or things happen. And it will also be necessary for the person who's recovering to have a strong treatment and aftercare plan that includes support. So I'm looking for those things when I'm considering how this parent or caregiver is recovering from their substance abuse problem. And then finally, just to talk a little bit about child abuse and neglect. So back to Nadine. Nadine tells you that once her dad forgot to pick her up from karate class and left her standing outside. She says it's one reason she believes her father is a bad one. So take a moment and think about what kinds of information or questions you might have when presented with these facts. Some of the things that I would want to know more about are, is this part of a larger pattern by dad, or is this just a one-time incident? And is there a child protection services history in this case? Does this behavior rise to the level of neglect? I'd also want to explore a bit Nadine's emotional perception versus the reality of what was happening. So was this a severe incident where the karate instructor had to call CPS because he couldn't locate dad? Or was this a communication problem? Like, you know, dad thought he was supposed to pick up at a certain time per mom, but that wasn't the time that was communicated to Nadine. So was that something that could be resolved or was resolved? And then finally, I want to think a little bit about what was the context in which Nadine reported this to me. What else was going on? Is a visit coming up? And that's why she might be mentioning this, because she's trying to avoid a visit. Like, what other contributing factors might be at play? So a little bit about child abuse and neglect. There is physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, and emotional maltreatment as types of child abuse and neglect. So physical abuse is the intentional use of physical force that can result in physical harm. So things like hitting, kicking, shaking, burning, or other signs of force against a child. Sexual abuse involves pressuring or forcing a child to engage in sexual acts. Emotional maltreatment refers to behaviors that harm a child's self-worth or emotional well-being. So that could include things like name calling or shaming, withholding love, or threatening the child. And then neglect is the failure to meet a child's basic physical and emotional needs. And these are things like housing, food, clothing, education, and access to medical care. It's important to note that neglect occurs when neglect isn't something that is occurring when, like, the parent doesn't have the means to do it. So for example, like, they've lost their job and they don't have the means to provide the food. But if they had finances and were using substances and spending money on substances, then that would be an example of neglect. So there's a differentiation there. Allegations of abuse and neglect are also common in custody cases. It's not necessarily your role to make a determination as to whether or not maltreatment occurred. And allegations of abuse by adults are different than disclosures of abuse by your client. So when allegations occur by your child, it's not by your child, by your client, it's really important to stay calm because how you respond initially will impact the child. It's really important. If they think that you are, nervous or you can't handle the information, they may not share again. You might be the first person they've disclosed to. It's also key to ask a lot of open-ended questions rather than anything that might be leading to gather information about what has happened. And then you'll want to consult with your mentor on the next steps. In some instances, you may decide that you do need to call Child and Family Services Agency to make a report. When you do that, the hotline worker will gather a lot of information from you. They will not give you their name. They will give you a number that is associated with their role. So you'll want to ask for that and write that down. About 80% of the cases or more won't make it beyond this initial phone call. So if they decide based on the information you share that they want to investigate, they'll determine that response, and depending on the severity, they may investigate immediately within 24 hours or within a certain time frame. The results of investigations are either unfounded and inconclusive, which means they don't know if it happened or not, substantiated, which is a confirmation that they believe that the abuse or neglect did happen, and then not listed here is unsubstantiated, which is when they believe that it did not happen. A note about resilience. I mean, we've talked about some difficult things today. Domestic violence, substance abuse, child abuse, and neglect. They can all be traumatic experiences. But some children might be exposed to something that has an adverse impact on them, and some children might not experience the same adverse impact. So it really just depends on the child, their temperament, what other supports they have in their life. So the signs and symptoms of adversity will vary for our clients. And the resiliency that children have will impact how they respond. So you'll find other information in your manual about signs and symptoms of abuse and neglect, so I encourage you to check that out. And I think that's it. Jen?
Yes, thank you so much, Kim. Thank you so much. Thanks for everyone joining us for part 3 today to round out our custody guardian ad litem training. As a reminder, we do have an evaluation of this training. Excuse me, to hear your feedback about it. If you have questions about the work, anything that you've seen in the training, we're happy to chat. You can send me an email if you're interested in the case, if you want to talk about that process, any follow-up to the training, part 1, part 2, part 3, any of it, feel free to reach out. And thank you again for your interest in doing this work with us. We greatly appreciate it, and happy to work with you in the future if we're not already working together now. Thanks again.